Hello, everyone. My name is Stephanie Boozer. I'm with CUGC HQ, and I am excited to welcome you to today's user share with Esther Barthel and Dave Brett, both of whom are very involved with CUGC, and we're excited to see what they have for us today. Really quickly, before we hand things over to them, I just want to let you all know about CUGC in case you're not already a member and we're new to you. Love for you to come out to our website and see what all we have. We've got local groups all over the world. We have tons of forums and blog posts and webinars and lots of content and resources for all of you guys to check out. And speaking of those resources, I think today's presentation actually was born out of a forum thread, if I'm correct about that. So without further ado, I will turn things over to Esther to get us started and introduce herself and get us going. And here comes the screen, Esther.
So can everyone see my screen?
Not yet.
Let me just start the presentation. Hang on. Oh, show my screen. That helps, of course. I'm not nervous at all. Don't worry, guys. So hi, everyone. Today it's all me and Dave sharing some of our automation adventures. And I'll give Dave the honor of introducing himself.
Thank you, Esther. So as you can see, my name is Dave Brett. I'm based in Liphook in the UK. I'm a Citrix CTP, CUGC network and SIG leader, and a community contributor on dubs.davcc.com. Can be found online using the Twitter handle @dbretton.
Okay, Dave, thanks. And for those of you that do not know me, maybe in person or through the social media, my name is Esther Barthel. I'm based in Lemmer, which is a very small town in the Netherlands. And as of August this year, I started my own company, and also known as a Citrix CTP and a Microsoft MVP. And an IT mentor, or a mentor for the My CUGC Women in IT program that we are running. But that's not what we're here to talk about. So today we're going to talk about RESTful APIs and NITRO and how we're using them to automate our NetScaler configurations. And just to keep things very interesting, we added some demos, and I'll make sure that Dave has enough time to share with us his unified gateway script as well. So let's get started with the introduction. For those of you who are not aware of RESTful APIs, let's just start at the basics. The main thing with RESTful APIs is that they are based on a client-server architecture, are stateless, and more importantly are based on industrial standards. In this case, it's running on top of the HTTP protocol. And this makes it easy to use it in even firewalled environments because, well, I don't know about you guys, but I have a less hard time talking to my firewall admins if I want to open up port 80 or 443 instead of some exotic port that they haven't heard of. And if I'm talking about NITRO, we're talking about the RESTful service that runs on the NetScaler, which allows us a more human-readable interaction with our NetScaler. And there are also different NITRO SDKs available that you can download from your NetScaler appliance. So why would you use NITRO? Well, basically, it will help us to develop an automation strategy to include NetScaler configurations into our overall Citrix infrastructure automation. And I think nowadays it's becoming more essential for data center automation as well. And especially as of NITRO 10.5 and up, a lot of enhancements have been made, which allows us to even do file operations, SSH commands like ping and trace route, and new APIs are added with each release of NITRO. So what do we need if we want to use NITRO? First of all, which kind of makes sense, is we want to have a NetScaler 9.2 or later that runs the NITRO service. And we need an account that has execute permissions to authenticate ourselves when we create our first session. And of course, we need to be able to access the NetScaler through its NetScaler IP address that has management access enabled. But that's the server side of the configuration. We also need a REST client. And in this example, because that's one of my favorite REST clients, I'm showing Postman, which is a plugin for Google Chrome or an add-on that allows you to have like a GUI, more graphical interface to quickly check if you have your URL in place and if your JSON is correctly formatted. But today we're going to focus on using a programming language that has REST support in it. And you can download several, as I mentioned, from the NetScaler itself through as a NITRO SDK. But there's none of SDK available for PowerShell. So we'll need to use native REST API support from PowerShell today. Another thing that's very important, and I know Dave will talk about it some more later on, is the fact that you should be aware of the NITRO API documentation that is available. Because the documentation, which can be downloaded from your NetScaler, gives you an overview of all the different functionalities that it supports, like sending configuration information to your NetScaler, or retrieving statistical information. And if you zoom in on the different resource types that are available, you'll notice that it gives you detailed description of the operations that are available, in this case for enabling NetScaler features. And it also specifies all the information you need to make your REST API call. So when we're talking about RESTful APIs, I already mentioned that it's based on HTTP protocol. And if you want to make an HTTP call, you need to provide quite some data. You need to provide the HTTP method that you want to use, a URI, and more importantly, you also need to provide a request header that contains some metadata, like the formatting of the data itself and the request body that has your actual message content. If we're talking about NITRO specific, you'll notice that it kind of requires you to provide the same set of information. So you also need to provide the HTTP method, which can be GET to retrieve information from the NetScaler, POST to send new information to the NetScaler, PUT to update existing information on your NetScaler, or delete to remove existing information from the NetScaler. And you also need to provide a URI, or in case of NITRO, you need to specify a URL, which usually starts with HTTP or HTTPS if you want to make a secure connection, the NetScaler IP address /nitro/v1. And then we have two options. As I mentioned at the beginning, you can either use NITRO to manipulate or to edit the configuration of the NetScaler by using /config, or you can retrieve statistical information. So you can add /stat to the URL. In case of the demos this evening, I'm going to use configuration manipulation, so I'm going to add /config to the URL. But NITRO needs a bit more information than just this URL. You also need to specify which resource type you want to address. And in some cases, when you want to specify or address a specific load balancing fee server, you also need to specify the resource name. In my example, I want to perform an operation on the NetScaler features. More specifically, I want to be able to enable some features. So in this case, I also need to specify an action in my URL that lets NITRO know which type of action I want to perform, like enable. So now we have two sets of information down to make a REST API call. As I mentioned, there's still some more information we need to provide, like the content type in our request header to specify data formatting. At the beginning, when Citrix introduced NITRO, we had to specifically specify the content type for each resource type that we were addressing. But as of the NetScaler 10.1 and up, we can use a generic content type and just specify application/JSON as our content type to ensure that NITRO is aware of the fact that the message body contains JSON formatted payload. And that JSON formatted payload is what is added to the request body of our REST API call. And I've included some examples of JSON payload. To sum it all up, it's quite a lot of information, but once you have all this information, you can easily translate this into a REST API call. So let's look at that. So how are we going to automate our NetScaler configurations? First of all, as I mentioned with PowerShell, there is no SDK available. So what we're going to do with PowerShell is we're going to use the built-in commandlet Invoke-RestMethod to make that REST API call. And the Invoke-RestMethod gives us two different syntaxes, so to speak. When we first create our session to the NetScaler, we can specify a session variable that holds our session information, which can be used in the REST API calls that we want to make after that, and reuse that session we created by specifying that in the second example using the web session parameter. So with the Invoke-RestMethod, we basically specify all the information that we just gathered. We tell it which method we want to use. We specify the URI and the body, which is a JSON payload. So we'll also need to be aware of the fact that we need some formatting to create a JSON payload. And if we are looking at JSON, or JavaScript Object Notation as its acronym stands for, you'll notice that there are some differences in the formatting between JSON and PowerShell, as you can see in this example for an array, and also for an hash table. Basically, what we're going to do with PowerShell is we're going to use the PowerShell arrays and hash tables to create our JSON payload. So we need to be able to transform our PowerShell syntax or formatting to JSON. The good news is that PowerShell has a commandlet for that, the ConvertTo-Json commandlet, which simply allows us to create the array within PowerShell and have it converted to the JSON syntax formatting. So it's going to be very easy to just build that array of or hash table, or combination of arrays and hash table, as it has multiple layers, to JSON formatting by using the ConvertTo-Json. But one thing you need to be aware of when you're using the ConvertTo-Json commandlet is that it is configured to convert your PowerShell arrays and hash tables by default up to a depth of 2 This means that only the names and the network interfaces variables are taken into account, but the port names are not by default. By specifying a depth higher than 2, in this case it should be a minimum of 3, because I have 3 levels of arrays and hash tables that I need to convert, I can ensure that this time the port name is correctly transformed to the required JSON payload. So that's one of the first lessons that I wanted to share with you. So as we are now getting more familiar with PowerShell and making a REST API call, let's look at a basic example. So getting back to the information that I need to provide to make a REST API call that will enable the specified NetScaler features, well, I could always do that through the GUI of the NetScaler, which basically means I select the basic features, then check some boxes, click on OK, and everything is done and configured on my NetScaler. And for those of you who already have some knowledge of NITRO, you might know that the GUI uses NITRO calls as well. So translating this into really getting to work on a PowerShell script, let's go and check out the demo that I prepared. So I hope everyone can still see my screen, and I'll walk you through the script. As I mentioned, this is the NetScaler NITRO API documentation that gives you an overview of all the information that is available. And within the documentation is a getting started guide that explains how you can connect to a NetScaler appliance by specifying all the information I need to make, to make that REST API call. Of course, this is not going as planned. So what I wanted to show you is that the information gives me the HTTP method that I need to use, the URL, and even the formatting of the JSON payload that I need to include. So let's look at this first script. At the beginning I have some constants defined because, well, as I said, I can use a generic content type with all my Invoke-RestMethod calls. And this is just the basic information of the NetScaler that I'm using in this demo. So I already copied the information from the Getting Started guide, so I have all the information easily available within my script. So let's start by creating the JSON payload. So I'm just simply building my hash table and using the ConvertTo-Json function to create my JSON payload. So let me just quickly load the variables, and then I'll walk you through the script. So first of all, we're gonna create the JSON payload, and I'm just doing some write host commands in the script to give you some feedback on the formatting and the variables that I'm using. Next up, we're gonna call the Invoke-RestMethod by specifying the URI, which needs login, the JSON payload that I just created, the method post, and I'm gonna specify that the session, because this is my first call, is gonna be stored in a session variable. The content type, which is the generic setting, and basically this will make that REST API call. So let's check out the results. So as you can see, I'm getting an object back which has an error code which is 0, which is good. Everything worked fine. And a session ID, which is the session ID I can use or refer to in all the next REST API calls that I want to make. Zooming in on that session ID. Oh, no, what I meant was zooming in on the session variable that I specified with this parameter, the NetScaler session. You'll notice that it is a web request session object, and we can even zoom in on that further. Sorry, I just got distracted a bit. What I wanted to show you is the URL or the REST API call to retrieve the NetScaler features that are enabled. So to do that, I can easily go back to my NetScaler NITRO documentation, check some configuration set. Oh. And in my case, I need to go to the NetScaler feature. And as I shown, it gives you all kind of information on all the variables that I can specify and information on the operation enable. So if we go back to the script, you'll notice that I now have the URI that I can specify, and I can make that Invoke-RestMethod call with all the information. And as I'm using a GET method, I do not need to specify any JSON payload, because I'm now not sending information to the NetScaler, I'm trying to retrieve information. So if I now run this, and we can zoom in on the NetScaler feature information, you'll notice that it gives me all the NetScaler features. And for those of you that quickly interpret the outcome, you'll notice that it's still all features are defined as false. So to enable some features, once again, checking the documentation information, I now know which URL to specify. And I do need to create a JSON payload with the NetScaler features that I want to enable. So let's check if that payload was created. So it seems to have the right formatting. And I can once again run the Invoke-RestMethod to post that information. And if we're now going to check the results, it should feature no, I'm not doing the get yet, so sorry for confusing you and confusing myself. The downfall with using Invoke-RestMethod is you're not getting a good response if the action is successful. So in my case, the easiest way to check, oh, hang on, it's over here, is to log on to my NetScaler or use the get method with my Invoke-RestMethod. Go to settings, configure basic settings, and you'll notice that the settings are now configured. So let's get back to the slides. So one of the things that I notice is that it does take a lot of lines of code to simply create a script that enables the NetScaler features. So I was looking on the internet to see if there were easier ways to make REST API calls or use NITRO. I discovered a blog post from Citrix that gave me a PowerShell module to download. So with this PowerShell module, I got a lot of post method functions that allowed me to quickly, with one line of code, specify NetScaler features that I wanted to enable, to specify or configure the host name or DNS name servers. But that still felt like a very limited module. So I decided to extend the module to make sure that it had all the gets, deletes, and put for changes functions in there as well. Basically, I started to expand it even further with more functionality to ensure that it could be used to fully administer my NetScalers. And I'm still adding more and more functionalities to this module as I adapted it. Getting back at this example, you notice that it was quite some lines of code using the native Invoke-RestMethod. So with the PowerShell module, you're able to simply import the module into PowerShell, create your session, and then use the enable NS feature function, which basically brings it down to just a couple of lines of code and have all the magic happen in the background through the module. So this enabled me to create more PowerShell code that could represent like a template for quick installations. Like for instance, a template to quickly create a NetScaler load balancing configuration. And for those of you that haven't seen this before, I like to present all the NetScaler components in this way because it gives me a very easy way from left to right to read in the blue components that I have a vServer, that it is linked or bound to a service group that consists of 2 storefront servers with their corresponding IP addresses. And the bottom row is to be able to do HTTP to HTTPS redirection. So basically with this basic load balancing configuration, I ensured that I had all the functions in the module that were needed to configure everything that I wanted to have, like the rewrite actions and policies and the responder actions and policies. The functions to configure the servers that I needed, the service and the service groups, and even the monitors and the virtual servers. So even though that looks like quite some code, you'll notice that instead of having to go through all the menus for load balancing and go through each and every step to configure them, I now have a simple script, or simple, it still has a couple of lines of code, but it enables me to quickly get the basics up. In this case, I wanted to ensure that I included a default rewrite action and policy to add /citrix/store web to the basic URL, and to ensure that I have the responder policy and actions in place to do HTTP to HTTPS redirection. And just be able to add all the configuration. So if we run this script, it will quickly configure my app expert rules and then the vServer configuration. Going back to my NetScaler configuration, if I hit refresh, you'll now notice that the virtual servers are up and running. And to double check the configuration, let's go to http sf.demo.lab. And I'm using HTTP on purpose, of course, because I want to test, hoping that this all works. Unfortunately, that's... So I wanted to test if it does the HTTPS redirection. And the notice of not having a secure connection is due to the fact that I'm using a self-signed certificate. So if we refresh the page, you'll notice, because I'm having it set to round robin, and the green server has a weight of 2 and the blue has a weight of 1. So I have to hit refresh a couple of times. But you'll notice that it is doing some load balancing between the servers. So basically, that's just a quick rundown from me to show you some of the capabilities of using PowerShell in your to automate your NetScaler configurations. So I would like to give controls back to Dave, if I'm not mistaken, and he can continue the presentation.
You see my screen okay there?
Yes, I can see your screen.
Excellent. Thanks, Esther. So obviously Esther's given you a really good rundown of how to use NITRO and what you're looking for, and you know, doing some really funky stuff on your NetScaler using NITRO and PowerShell. I'm going to start with finding what you need. So when you start using NITRO and trying to configure your NetScalers and stuff like that, it can seem like a massively daunting task. You know, when you first start looking at these JSON payloads and the URIs you need, you just think, wow, there's literally thousands and thousands of different options that you can use to get what you need from the NetScaler. And it is kind of like a minefield. So the first thing you need to figure out is what exactly you need to set on the NetScaler to achieve what you want to achieve. And the best way of doing that, in my opinion, is, and this may sound obvious, to use the help. So Citrix have done a great job in documenting the NITRO API and what it can do. And you can download it directly from your appliance. So when you've installed your NetScaler, you can go to the Downloads tab and download the NITRO API documentation, and then literally just unzip it to your machine and fire up the index.html file. One thing to note there is make sure you allow block content if you're using IE, or it won't display the help files properly. And then once you've got it open, initially it's going to display the getting started guide, but what you'll see underneath that is the sections for the documentation. So you'll have two main sections there, one for config and one for stats. And Esther touched on this earlier. So the configuration, this is primarily used to push config, whether that be building new config or deleting or changing items and configuration items that are already present on your NetScaler or that you wish to be there. The stats node is generally for pulling info back and getting information from the NetScaler into your PowerShell script in this case to use as you wish. So if you look up on screen there, there's a snippet of code there that you would use to upload a file to a NetScaler using NITRO. So you can see the parameters we need. There's the URI up there, so the NetScaler IP, and then the rest of the URL that you're going to need, the method that you're using, the request header content, and the all-important JSON payload. So this is the information that you're sending in that table up to the NetScaler to process. So if you wanted to find out how to do that in the help, you would expand the configuration node first, and then go into system, and then into system file there. And each node that you expand has literally got hundreds or tens, hundreds, thousands of options within that individual node on what to do to achieve the task you want on the NetScaler. So when you click on system file, on the right hand side of the help window, it will display a bunch of information about that specific NITRO command that you want to run on the NetScaler. So if you click on add, for example, in this instance, what it will jump you down to this section of the help file. And you can see on here, this clearly shows you everything you need to use in PowerShell to execute that NITRO command on your NetScaler. So first, it will give you the URL you need, or the URI. It will give you the method that you need to use this config command. It will give you the request headers and the content type that you need to send, and it will also give you that all-important JSON payload. And the good thing about the help file, so if you click on add to add a specific task or a configuration item to your NetScaler, the payload that it displays in the help will show you all of the items that are writable within that single NITRO command, or NITRO trigger, for example. Certain commands, when you are looking at the help, there are certain things that are read-write and certain things that are read. Make sure the config items you wish to be setting are actually read-write. And it will also give you the HTTP status code that will come out of the NetScaler, telling you whether the command you've sent has succeeded or whether there's been a failure in that. So, you know, that's, in my opinion, that's one of the easiest ways to find what you need to send to the NetScaler to achieve any specific commands or config changes you want to do, and it's all in one place. And it's downloadable from the appliance that you're trying to run it on. So if we look at some common areas, and the reason this slide is up here is because initially when you start out on this sort of NITRO journey, you spend a lot of time flicking between those sub-nodes of the configuration item, the configuration help file, sorry, to try and find the exact commands that you want to run. So the reason I've put this up here is some of the common things that you need and the areas that you'll need to look for the commands you want within that help file. So if you look at the initial config of the NetScaler, most of the stuff you need to do that will be in the system subnode, the network subnode, and the NS subnode. Stuff like, you know, the system one for uploading your files, such as the license files, the network for your NSIP or SNIP, and the NS node for the host name, the features you want to enable, and activating that license file that you've uploaded earlier. For certificate management, you need to generally look in system and SSL. Again, system for uploading the files to the NetScaler, and then SSL for binding them, linking them, and specifying whether you're uploading a server cert or a CA cert. Load balancing is a big use case for NetScaler. There's a lot of people doing that. So the two nodes that I would generally look in the help file to get the information I need are basic and load balancing. The basic one being to add the servers, add the service groups and the bindings. And then the load balancing node to set up the vServer, pin the services and servers together, as well as assign the policies you want to apply to that load balancer. Something that isn't up there that probably should be is system and SSL within the load balancing common areas. Obviously, if you're doing 443 vServers, then you're going to need to upload your certificates and bind them to your load balancing. Unified Gateway, this is quite a big one for me, especially at the moment. I'm going to be looking at this later and hopefully doing a live demo. Basic, this is for your server side part. This is, if you think about a port 80 HTTP redirect, then you would need those servers up there. Load balancing, again, for the redirect. SSL for all your cipher groups and the certificates that you need. Content switching, this is where your front-end content switch for your unified gateway will be. Responder for the 80 to 443 forwarding, and rewrite for the STS header if you're not on NetScaler version 12. And of course, SSL VPN, where you will build your actual non-addressable gateway, or your session policies, the ticketing, and everything that makes up the rest of the unified gateway. And looking in a bit further into this, at the diagnostics node, there's a node in there called utility, which for one reason only is pretty cool, because you can send a ping using NITRO from the NetScaler. So if you're trying to debug or test something, you could write a quick PowerShell script to send a ping on behalf of your NetScaler and check connectivity, rather than spend the time to open PuTTY, jump onto it, get into shell and do it that way. So moving on and having a bit of fun with NITRO, we're going to look at creating a unified gateway fully automated. First, we need to understand what you would do on a NetScaler to configure a unified gateway. And you need to, when you're using NITRO, you need to understand, if you're trying to mirror what a wizard does on the NetScaler, you need to know what that wizard is doing and how, and the different config stages that wizard will take you through to get to your end product on the NetScaler. So if we're looking at Unified Gateway as an example, the first thing it's going to ask you to do is to give the name for the Unified Gateway, the IP and the port that you want to run it on, which is fairly standard. Then it's going to ask you for the certificate you want to use for that Unified Gateway. Then it's going to ask you for your LDAP or any other authentication policies you want to bind to the Unified Gateway. It will then ask for the theme you want to display to the user when you're using the gateway. Then it will ask you to define and present the application, so there's Zen Desktop Farm or SAS bookmarks or other applications that you want to send out to the users via the Unified Gateway, and then it will go on and build that. So what we're going to try and achieve here is doing that, but using NITRO to do it. You might ask, why use NITRO? And my thoughts on it are it's repeatable and portable, which is great. You can take that script into any customer, assuming it's correctly written and correctly error checked. You can then execute that and build them a unified gateway very quickly and have a little more control over rollback and error correction within the build process. As you'll see later, you can also give the customer an XML file up front, get them to fill out information that you would normally require from them to build their unified gateway for them, and then just pump that into your PowerShell NITRO script and just automatically build the unified gateway, and it's zero touch. So once you've got it configured and you know it works, if you get an outage on your NetScaler, you can have it, your unified gateway part stood up in minutes. So how do we achieve that using PowerShell? In a similar way to how Esther was talking earlier with the module, the PowerShell module, I've put together a NetScaler configure PSM1 file that you put in the PowerShell modules directory. And this, this module file has each function that you want to accomplish on your NetScaler, and the function is there to do one task and one task only. And then there's a NetScaler, there's a master build script as a result of that will read in the information that you give to your customer to fill out. So all their configuration information that can be seen on the top right there, such as their certs, their NetScaler IP, their LDAP, their bind account, their storefront details, that all goes in the XML file. Then there's a master build script which will read in everything from that XML file that the customer's given you, and then it will execute those functions in the order that you need to do to build your unified gateway. So let's have a look at it in action. As you can see, if this doesn't work, there's an in case of emergency video there ready to go. So what you can see here is this is a NetScaler that I've imported. It's got an NSIP and there is no other config been done on that NetScaler at all currently. So if we log into that, you'll see that that's the standard just deployed NetScaler screen that I'm sure everyone on this webinar is used to seeing. There's no subnet IP, no host name, no DNS names, name servers, anything like that, and no licenses up on there. Another thing we've got is a link to the workspace URL, and you can see that that's currently not responding. So there's no unified gateway out there and ready to go. So if we just undock the NetScaler console so you can see what's happening. These are the scripts here. So if you look at the settings file first, these are all the settings that I want to use within my script, and this is an example of what you could have given the customer. So it has some storefront information, some domains, some addresses like IP addresses for the unified gateway that I need to use, the controllers that I want to use, the features that I want to enable, some DNS information. And then the master script here reads in everything from that XML file. It will do the initial config, then it will do a warm reboot of the NetScaler to apply the license file. Once the NetScaler comes back up, it will wait for that, and then it will continue with the build, set up the unified gateway, and then time it. So if we execute that script, so you can see on the left here, the NetScaler is now going down for a warm reboot. And this is now doing two checks. So the first check it will do is make sure the NetScaler is responding on a specific IP. So the NSIP that the customer gives you in the XML file, it will keep querying that. So if you do a hard reboot, obviously the NetScaler will go down. It will keep testing that IP until it comes back up. Once it's back up, it will then query the management port of the NetScaler, because whilst the IP address may be coming back with a response, the management port on that NetScaler may not be in a state that's ready to handle NITRO commands being sent to it. So this now is waiting for that port 80 to come back up on that NetScaler. Again, as Esther said earlier, that could be port 443. And then you can see there, as soon as that's come up, it's run through the rest of the config. And the last thing you should be doing is saving the config on the NetScaler, because as you know, there's a run and a saved config. So you don't want to execute all this NITRO and get it all built how you want it, and then once you restart it, that's all gone. And that took, according to this, 65.8 seconds to build a unified gateway, which is pretty good. So if I run up my web link to the Unified Gateway, you can see it's the same URL. Unified Gateway is up and running. If I then log into that, this is using the build that I've configured using NITRO. I can execute a ICA connection, or EDT in this case, to the admin desktop. And with any luck, that should launch. And to prove that this isn't something that I've got on my Mac here without being within the environment, if I switch back in there and run up Workspace, you can see there that I can also log into the gateway and everything's running internally. So if we quickly, I realise we're fast running out of time, jump onto this NetScaler. This is the same NetScaler as earlier. You can see the LDAP profile is all set up, everything's running, it's configured. Your non-addressable unified gateway, the NetScaler gateway part is there. The session profile and policy are there. I've done web in this case just to speed things up. Under content switching, so your front-ended unified gateway content switch is there. The certificate's bound to it. If you look in SSL, you can see your wildcard cert has been uploaded and imported and linked to the root cert. You also have your DNS name servers and your DNS suffixes all in place. And you can see there that the running config's not changed. So that's a saved NetScaler deployment, all done via NITRO. So where to go next? The scripts. And Esther, you probably want to come off mute here because a lot of this is your IP.
I can do that. Basically, for those of you that are interested in the PowerShell module that I have been created, I created a small repository on GitHub and made sure that all the scripts, even the ones used in this demo, and some more scripts are out there and available for downloads. And then in case we were running short on or had some time to spare, I've added some bonus slides in this presentation as well, which will be available after this presentation. What I run into when I was testing my NetScaler connections, and especially the secure connections with HTTPS, is that I got these weird errors and basically not giving me access to my NetScaler appliance. And if you click on for the next slide, yes, thank you. You'll notice that I found a small article by Microsoft that basically explained to me that as the NetScaler is running a self-signed certificate out of the box, the errors are made by the CRL check, the certificate validation check that is included in PowerShell. And by using this quick fix, you can simply bypass that CRL check and connect to the NetScaler without any errors, even if it's using a self-signed certificate. And even though the setting is created, no problem. Even though the setting is created just for that session, you can also make sure by the end, if you're closing your session to the NetScaler, to also reset the CRL check back to the original value with this command line. one of the things you should be aware of when you want to upload files to the NetScaler is that the system file option that is included in NITRO can only upload files up to 2 MB in size. So if you want to, for instance, upload larger files, you'll run into some errors with the built-in functionality. So what I did was I checked the internet to see if there are some other options available. And if you go to the next slide, thank you, Dave, you'll notice that there is, oh, this is still explaining it, I'm sorry. Basically what I'm showing you in this slide is that you need to do base64 encoding as well to include the file in your NITRO call. But there is another option which is called the WinSCP wrapper that is available to install through PowerShell that allows you to easily select the file that you want to upload, specify that, and it basically just uploads it through the WinSCP wrapper. And this works for files larger than 2 MB in size. So, and then I realized that everything I was doing up till this point was still basically focused on NetScaler configuration automation. And I wanted to make sure that I could include, especially with the virtualized environments that we are administrating these days, that I could include a deployment strategy for my NetScalers as well. And for those of you that have been working with importing NetScaler VPXs on their hypervisors, you usually still have to go through that first setup where you have to specify the NetScaler IP address in the console. And then I discovered this knowledge base article from Citrix that basically explained, in this case, the XE commands to import a NetScaler VPX on SendServer and then specify the NetScaler IP address as well. So in this case, when the NetScaler VPX first boots, it checks the extended settings on SendServer for the VM. If an IP address is specified, and if that is the case, then that will be the NetScaler IP address that it's going to use. And I do really realize that not everyone works with SendServer. So I checked the internet once again and found a similar article for ESX, which enables me to import a NetScaler VPX on ESX or within vSphere and configure the same extended virtual machine settings to automatically have it boot with the specified IP address. And I know there's another hypervisor, of course, the SDX. Well, that one is very easy because that's just creating a new instance with an IP address, as you can see, and you can go to the next slide, Dave.
Sorry.
No problem. Just following your lead, trying not to run too much in overtime. But I do realize there's a third hypervisor that is becoming more and more popular, like Hyper-V. And I did check the Citrix product documentation, which gave very clear instructions on how you need to create an ISO image with an XML file on it called user data that contains the IP address. Link that as your boot image on the NetScaler VPX instance that you imported, and then magic should happen. And I have to admit that I haven't gotten around to try to translate this into a PowerShell script. But if you go to the next slide, you'll notice that Dominique Broegling has been so kind to share his script with the community because he added it to the DevBlackOps repository with his NITRO scripts. And basically all the steps that were described in the article are now translated to PowerShell commands, enabling you to incorporate all your automation and NetScaler deployments in your automation strategy as well. And this is just one more slide to show you where I got all my resources and information from.
Back over to you, Stephanie.
Okay. I think that you guys answered some questions in line, and so any questions that were put in that that didn't get answered, we'll get to afterwards. We can put them out in the forums. You'll see in the chat window, I put a link to the networking SIG, and that is a place that you can go. If you join that, there's lots of content out there, forums, blogs, previous webinars, lots of stuff for you guys. I'm going to grab the screen back really quickly. And what
Stephanie, I think your audio's dropped.
of speakers, I'm sure you recognize a lot of these faces. Our headliner is Kurt Romer. He is the Chief Security Strategist at Citrix. And if you register and attend, you have a chance to win an Amazon Echo Show. And also want to direct you over to mycugc.org, remind you about the networking SIG. Today's webinar will be available out there tomorrow, but you'll also receive an email with links to the recording for this webinar and also previous webinar or the forum thread for this event. And you make sure you follow us on Twitter to stay up to date with everything that we have going on. And last but not least, we have a very short, easy survey for you. It takes no time at all. It's anonymous, and it helps us plan all of our future content, including webinars. So we'd love to have your feedback on that. And with that, I will give you all back to the rest of your day. Thanks again, Dave. Thanks, Esther. It was a great presentation, and looking forward to more in the future. Thanks, guys.
You're welcome, Stephanie.
You're welcome.